I have interesting views on the Westminster Model because I find it infinitely fascinating as a way of talking about the way our government works. It means an executive that is formed from the legislature. It's the way in which, in my special area of interest, we talk about a permanent civil service. So unlike America, one that doesn't turn over with each new incoming government, but actually get that institutional memory, that continued service by civil servants. Those sorts of things I find talking about the Westminster Model and trying to tease out what it was once and also what it is now really interesting. That's the way in which we can debate how meaningful are changes that are going on. Are there things that are happening that are undermining the good qualities of that model? Are there things that are happening that can help reinforce it? But I also have to stop myself sometimes because I have to remember I engage a lot with people in Westminster and they don't recognise really the term Westminster Model if you talk about it in that sense. They do if you're thinking about it as how it compares to, say, Germany or America, and how it's much more similar to the governments in New Zealand, Canada, Australia. But they don't wouldn't sign up to all of the theoretical models that underpin how academics talk about the Westminster Model. So finding the difference between the two is really interesting because it's the chance that you get to see how sort of models work in practice and what it means for the people who are in them to be referred to in that way. I think it's very relevant at the moment. I think it's a lot to do with what's going on if the debates around Brexit and what we should do. Obviously, there are a lot of important discussions that we as a country, the different political parties, media, public and so forth are having around the future economic model, trade relationships, all sorts of practical issues. But at the heart of it, not just the end result of Brexit, i.e., the idea that we want to take back control or take back powers from European Parliament, European Commission into our own Parliament, but it's actually the process of Brexit that I find most interesting for this. What role should Parliament play in and around Brexit? How much depth do we need to make sure of information that Parliament has so that it can scrutinise the process during the process, not just after it happens? And I find it quite warming as well to see so many parliamentarians really getting involved in this. Again, academics have oftentimes talked about the sort of highs and lows of Parliament and how relevant it is, and if you have governments with big majorities, is Parliament so important a factor? And I think it's undeniable at the moment that the combination of both Brexit and a minority Parliament means that, Parliament is really an important place, and it's great to see the media taking a good focus on it. I think it is true to say there have been some massive changes in the last 30 years. There are obviously key moments in our history. We've got 1,000 years of parliamentary history to look for big constitutional changes that have happened. But the big changes that we talk about at the moment, obviously prior to Brexit, the change to the European Union was a big constitutional change. The relationship with the European Parliament, with the European Commission, with other European heads of state, that was a very different way of operating to most political systems that we see elsewhere in the world. So that was already a big change. Now we're taking it back, so that's going to change our constitution further and in more rapid and drastic ways. But there are other really big important changes that have happened in the last 30 years, including devolution. The relationship with the other three devolved governments and how that has operated, how that's evolved, how that will now be affected by Brexit. This is a really important thing. There are other changes that we've been going through but which haven't really sort of worked their way through, including the House of Lords. The change to getting rid of most hereditary peers in 1998 was a big change, but it's still quite unreformed. It's still quite recognisable to the House of Lords that has existed, for the last 100 years since the 1911 Parliament Act. So there are other big changes that will need to happen, but yes, it is a time of constitutional flux. I think it's possible. It's too much to say revolution without end. I think the British Constitution is something that is fluctuating. Unlike other countries that have a fully codified constitution, by which we mean something that's not only just written in one place, but also can be then administered through the courts. So you can take people to court for breaking the constitution. They also have constitutions in flux. That's why you get amendments to the constitution. But we don't have it all codified in one place. It's written down in all sorts of different places, but it's a combination of legislation and things that are just sort of precedents and ways in which we have traditionally behaved, or how a part of the Constitution has acted previously. That kind of stuff has always been changing. It's always evolved for a new era. I think at the moment, these big changes, we are going through a phase where I cannot quite see the end. We have a lot of big issues to work out, what our relationship should be to each other as devolved organisations, what the relationship of Westminster should be to the rest of United Kingdom, what kind of parliament we want. You know, do we want changes to the House of Lords? Do we want sort of greater devolution within England? What will our eventual relationship be to our European partners and to the EU more generally? There are so many big questions that I think we're facing at the moment that, yes, we're a long way off of the end game of this particular bit, but I think we're a long way from the beginning of the end. There are different views about this, and I myself am a bit torn on it. On the one hand, yes, you can see how it would be great to have something that's simpler, easy to explain, and we have tried to do this. The government, the Cabinet Office have produced a document which explains some of the basics of how the executive operates, what the rules and regulations and so forth are around there. But it's not something that can be used in the courts to sort of check as a check on behaviour. We have different kinds of checks in the system to make sure that people are accountable, that processes and so forth happen in the right way. I think there is value in having the flexibility of the system that we've got. I think given the weight of history of different kinds of relationships with different parts of our government, different parts of our parliament, different sort of all sorts of constitutional ins and outs, it's more difficult to bring it together in one document, because there's also a process you need to go through if you're codifying any document, which is making sure that everyone's involved. I'm not sure at the moment, with Brexit happening, with all the rest of the challenges that we're facing as a country at the moment, that we could have that debate about what the Constitution is that we want, given we're already right in the middle of a process of changing it. So there's a certain sort of cart and horse kind of debate you need to have about that, of should we change the Constitution as we go on and write it down and codify it, or do we go through this process and then have a think about, okay, what do we want it all to look like?